guys, welcome back to the Bonser Musical Instrument Shop. My name is John. So I've spent the last couple minutes going through my my stash of fingerboards over here, and this is the piece of wood that I've picked out for our project. It's a nice dark straight grain piece of Gaboon ebony, and I milled it flat and straight and then trimmed the edges, and we're ready to set up to start cutting the fret slots. So my first step in cutting the fret slots, the way I do it anyway, is with this template. So this is CNC cut and ordered from one of the guitar supply houses, and it's already cut to our 24 3/4 inch scale length that we're going to do for this guitar. And basically what I want to do is attach it to the fretboard. Let's see, I'm going to pick out the best direction for it. And I'm just going to take a piece of tape here and wrap this around each end. I've clamped my slotting jig. This is something that I built myself. I've clamped this to the bench firmly. And this is set up so that it has a small shim in here that corresponds to the cut on the miter here. And what happens is the fret slot on the template board will sit onto that shim that locks it in place. And then I take my gauge fret saw. This is the kerf of this saw is measured to make the appropriate sized slot for a fret wire tang. And I just basically make a cut. This top piece here will stop the saw against the back and give me the appropriate depth for my cut. And I just kind of cut until it stops cutting and then move to the next position. And that way I can get basically a perfectly duplicated fret slotting pattern to my template. Something like that, and you can see that this slot is perfectly in line with that slot. And just rinse and repeat. Now that we have the fret slots cut all the way down the board, I've been doing a little bit of layout here for our next steps. So I've gone ahead and drawn a center line. You probably can't see it because it's in pencil, but there's a center line down the middle here. And then I've also marked the center line on the ends of the board. And that allows me to mark the positions for the fret markers, which I have here, little pearl dots. And I just take my calipers and take a measurement on the fret slot from, top to bottom here. Take the reading and then cut that in half, and that allows me to find the position in the middle between the two. And then I'll mark that with a punch, and then later on we can go ahead and drill those out. What we're going to work on now is tapering the fingerboard. So I have my center line drawn here, and I want to carefully mark out our nut width, which in this case is going to be 1 5/8. So I'll center that on the center line and give myself a mark here. And then the general rule of thumb is that whatever the nut width is, if you add 3/8 to that, that's going to be the width of the neck at the 12th fret. So 1 5/8 plus our 3/8 gives us a 2-inch width at the 12th fret. So I'll also give myself a couple marks there. And then I just connect those two lines with straight edge all the way down the fretboard, both sides. So the next step is to take this to the bandsaw, rip off our waste, and then we'll carefully joint that until we just touch that pencil line. And that should give us our perfect taper. One thing I forgot to mention, I think we're going to do binding on this fretboard. So we need to narrow this board down by the width of the binding, which, let's grab my thou calipers here. So the binding is about 40 thou, so we need to take probably one more pass down each side of the board on the joiner. It will get us to where we want to go. Okay, so if I put my binding up here and take another measurement now that I've thinned this out, and we're right at 2. And 5/8, 1 5/8. Or over here at the drill press, and I've got a 1/4 inch Forstner bit here. That matches the size of our fret dots. I want to use a Forstner bit because the point will fit into those little stamp marks that we made on the fretboard and give us a nice center, and then these bits also, just by their design, cut nice flat bottom holes, which is what we want for the inlay. To install these fret dots, I'm going to use super glue. Now these, I'm not sure if you can see this, but these definitely have like a grain to them. So what I tend to do is make sure the grains go in the same way on each dot. A little bit of super glue in the hole, and get that lined up. So it's sticking it to my finger. Looks good. And then I have a little piece of black, and I'll just tap that in flush. And then generally I'll put wick a little bit more super glue. This is water thin super glue, by the way. Just around the hole like that. Let it dry, and there you go. That's installed. So here's my setup for the fretboard radiusing. I have the fretboard taped down to my table saw top, just because it's a nice flat surface. And then I have the fence set up so that it's square to our center line. And then generally what I do is use a white colored pencil and mark in the board, and that lets me keep track of the as I sand it, it'll sort of work its way in from the edges to the middle. And the idea is to get rid of all of this flat area with the pencil on it. When we're done in radius, it should all be black. And then this is our tool. It's a radius sanding beam. It has our 10-inch radius cut into it, and it's nice and square. And so what I do is put this up against the fence, and I hold pressure that way against it and sand back and forth, like so. Until I get the radius sanded in. So you can see here as I continue to sand this down, these stripes of bare wood sort of work their way towards the middle because we're creating that radius. And every once in a while, I'll go ahead and check and make sure we're sanding evenly. And we'll continue going. So now that we've got our fretboard all nicely radiused and straight, I took a couple of minutes and sanded this up through a couple of different grits. The sanding beam is an 80 grit sandpaper, and that's a little too rough for our purposes. So 120, 220, and then I've got this sanded to 320. So the fret wire I've chosen for this guitar is it's 95 thousandths, which is kind of late 50s Gibson spec. It's a pretty good all-around what we would consider by modern standards a medium fret wire. There's a couple of things that we have to do before we can press these frets in, however, to the fretboard in preparation. So if you think of a piece of fret wire as an extrusion, it has a crown, like this, a crown, and then it has a tang, and then little barbs on the tang that hold the frets into the slots. Our fret saw cuts this width, of course, but because we cut these slots flat, right? The fretboard was flat, and now because they're radiused, they can be probably deep enough in the middle, but they're not probably going to be deep enough on the ends. And so to fix that, I have my fret saw set up with a stop, and I've carefully fit the frets, and I want to make sure that I cut these slots just slightly deeper than they need to be. The danger, of course, is that if the slot's not deep enough, when we go to press our frets in, it's going to bottom out in the bottom of the slot, right here, and we'll have a gap underneath the crown, and we don't want that. We want these crowns to be nice and flat to the board. So I'm going to go ahead and just take my saw, find that slot, and saw until it stops sawing. And it doesn't usually take too much at this point. You know, we're just removing just a tiny bit of material, usually on either end, and that's probably enough to get us where we need to go. Okay, now that we have the slots down to the proper depth, one more step before we can start pressing the frets in. If we go back to this drawing here, because the frets are an extrusion, this inside corner here is actually pretty round. You know, it's super tiny, obviously, but still round nonetheless. Now, if we come in with a sharp fretboard edge, that's not gonna let our crown seat all the way. So we want to knock this corner off, and to do that, there's a small triangular file, and it just takes just a 2 or 3 strokes across each one is plenty, just to knock that little corner off. And the final step in preparation for pressing in the frets, I've given the board a little bit of wax here on the surface, trying to avoid getting any wax in the slots. And then I blew all the slots out with my air compressor really well. I'm going to make sure that there's absolutely nothing down inside those slots. We're over here at the drill press, and I'm going to show you how I prefer to put frets into a fretboard. Traditionally, frets were hammered in, so you put the fret in here and use a hammer and whack on it until you get it seated. You know, things like acoustic guitars, existing guitars where you're doing repair work and stuff, that's cool. But what I prefer to do is press my frets, and I like to do it on a blank fretboard before I glue it on. So I have a caul set up. The drill press is unplugged, obviously, so this isn't going to be spinning. And you can see this caul is a brass insert that matches the radius of the fretboard perfectly. It's also coved out, you can see here that, and so the fret will sit right in there and not shift side to side. And I buy my fret wire pre-cut to length, and it's pre-radiused. This is a 10-inch board. What I prefer is a 9.5-inch radius, and that way it's just slightly over radiused, and that way the ends of the frets tend to sit and not poke up. So the procedure for installing the frets is as follows. Get the fret started in the slot. I'll try to keep my hands out of the way here. And I bring the press down, and I want it in the middle of the fret, or the fretboard, and then I just give it a little press, and then what I tend to usually do is sort of walk it out towards the edges a bit and give the ends just a little extra torque. And you can see that seats the fret absolutely perfectly, no gaps. Now that we have the frets trimmed to the side of the board, what I like to do is just put a couple of drops of super glue and wick that underneath the frets. There's a little bit of a gap because we cut this fret slots just slightly deeper than the frets, and I feel like filling that with glue once it hardens up, it helps the frets stay in place, but it also helps the transfer of sound and prevents us from having any dead frets. A little time scraping the frets here and cleaning up all the super glue, and then I put a coat of wax on the board again, just to make the next step where we're going to apply the binding glue not stick quite so bad. I also took a file and dressed the ends of the frets and the fretboard, so this is nice and square and flat now, and we're ready to apply our binding strips. I already put the bottom one on, that one goes on first, and then I have the couple pre-cut lengths here. We're going to use binding glue, funny enough. This stuff is basically jellied acetone, and it works really well, at least in my opinion. You can use super glue, that gets pretty messy. You can also tape it in place and then wick acetone in. It'll sort of it just kind of melts this binding and sticks it in place. I haven't had a whole lot of luck just using straight acetone in the past. Doesn't seem to stick quite as well for me, and this stuff works great. You just got to make sure you get plenty on there, get it well taped down. It dries really quick. Here's our fingerboard, with all the binding all done. I took some time and carefully scraped the back nice and flat. We'll probably work on this area just a little bit more. I don't really want any glue on the back of this, and when we glue it to the neck, we want wood-to-wood contact so that the wood glue will work well. But anyway, I mixed up a little bit of what I call binding paste, and this is just some scraps of binding melted down into some acetone. You can see it makes kind of this gel, I guess you'd call it. And this is what acetone does to this binding. I've got a couple of little spots that I need just a little hair more on these fret nibs here, especially. What I can do is just kind of put a little dab in there and it will melt in. And you can make repairs this way pretty easily. I'm set up here scraping the tops of the bindings. We've got the bottom scrape flush with the bottom of the board, and now we need to work on the tops here and get rid of this extra material and leave, so scrape it down flush to the fretboard, but leave these little nibs at the ends of the frets. And so I have a sharp chisel here. It looks a little dirty, but it's nice and sharp. And the plastic cuts really easily with a chisel. So I'll carefully go in here and kind of work my way down close to the fretboard, working into that corner like so, and then I'll come in and chop the excess out like that. And then I'll come in from the other side and do the same thing. Being careful the whole time not to nick the fretboard if we can avoid it. Okay. Now I'll come in with my Stanley scraper and box cutter blade, I guess it is, and using the fretboard surface, since the plastic cuts faster than the wood, I'll come in and scrape and slowly kind of rocking the blade this direction towards the edge of the binding, and just until it scrapes it smooth like that. Kind of clear out some of this extra stuff. And I have this small square file, and you can see on this side here I've ground the teeth off of it, so it gives us a safe edge. So I'm going to come in with a safe edge down on the board, so I'm not cutting anything, and that allows me to work into this corner nice and tight. And then I'll just kind of roll the binding over using the actual fret itself as kind of a template. And then I'll come in and do the other side here. And then if I flip the file to the safe edge towards the fret, I can really make sure I get that corner nice and cleaned out and blended. And then a couple more licks with my scraper here, just really lightly, to clean up the file marks. Like so. And we're left with these little fret nibs. Okay, so I've got this sanding block set up here, nice and square to the table, and I'm just dressing these edges, getting the inlays of the side markers nice and fleshed out, and making sure that this edge of the fretboard is nice and straight. We're going to be using that to write a bearing bit in the router table eventually to taper the actual neck blank once this is glued in place. But otherwise, this fretboard is ready to glue onto the neck.